Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We welcome you all to our second Research Week in Investigation, organized by the Vicerrectorado de Investigaciones. Before introducing our guest, a few words from our Vice-Rector, Professor Osvaldo Morales.
Thank you to everybody. Professor Robertson, I want to say you welcome one more time to ESAN. Professor Robertson is a part of our family. He is a staff from our international week, ¿no? And Professor, please join us. Un aplauso, por favor.
Thank you, Professor. Just let me say a few words about our speaker today. Professor Robertson from the Northeastern University, located in Boston, USA, is an expert in international ethical, behavioral, and strategical differences. He has special expertise in Latin America, where he did spend a considerable amount of time. Today's presentation is culture and market analysis. Can we go deeper? Will provide us a better approach and understanding of how market responds to cultural, technological, political factors and their impact on companies' strategies. After his presentation, we have a few minutes for questions. And now, yes, please, be welcome, Professor Robertson.
Ok, buenos días. Es un placer estar aquí otra vez, mi familia acá. Bueno, voy a hacer mi presentación en inglés, sin embargo. Chris Robertson, and it's been a long time since I've been here at ESAN, probably 4 years, but I've been here many, many times. And I arrived in Lima yesterday for a wedding, actually. I'm not getting married, I'm already married. But a friend of ours, a family friend, their daughter's getting married, so thought I would add some fun to the trip and come and do a presentation here at ESAN and re-engage with the ESAN community. I look forward to returning as well to International Week. And I was just speaking with Professor Armando Borda, and I'm happy to announce that in May 2023, I will be bringing about 25 MBA students from Northeastern University in Boston, where I teach here to Lima and here to ESAN as well. So that will be an exciting dialogue between the two cultures and universities. So today what I have planned for you all is a kind of a mixed presentation. I understand we have a mixed audience of students, undergraduate, MBA, some online, and PhD students and faculty. So as I thought about what can I do for 4 different groups, I thought I would put together a little bit of a blend of things. My background is in international business, strategy, cross-cultural management. And you can see my topic today, culture and market analysis. Can we go deeper? And that's really what I'm going to do the first half of my presentation, about 30 minutes. And after that, I will share 3 research papers that may be more of interest to the faculty and doctoral students, 3 research papers that I'm working on. But I think the topics will be interesting to everybody. I'm not going to dive deep into the papers, just kind of an overview of what I'm doing and what we're planning on researching. So let's get started. So today's presentation, as I mentioned, culture, market analysis, and then 3 papers I'll briefly review. Revisiting strategy and stuck in the middle. It's a study we're doing about strategic groups and competitive strategy, and we looked at restaurants, in particular the steakhouse niche in the US, cultural distance and moral intensity, another paper we're starting to collect data on, and then I'll talk about Chinese investment in Latin America, which is a very hot topic. My background, I went to Florida State University for my PhD, and I guess not on this slide is, before that, I lived in Ecuador. I lived in Quito. I was a professor at Universidad San Francisco de Quito, and in Cumbaya, circa de Quito. So that's where I guess I learned my Spanish more in Ecuador than Peru. But I also have traveled quite a bit throughout Latin America. I've published extensively on the topics of cross-cultural management and strategy in a number of different journals, including Strategic Management Journal, Organization Science. I was twice here in Lima as a Fulbright scholar at the Universidad de Lima, once for 6 months and once just for 1 month. And then also Fulbright grant, I went to Bogota, Universidad del Rosario, about 5 years ago in Bogota. I worked for Hasbro toy company. You probably know Hasbro. My Little Pony, G.I. Joe, Transformers. Depending on the year, Hasbro and Mattel are the two largest toy companies in the world. And if Barbie's not very popular one year, that's a Mattel, then Hasbro's bigger, more revenues. But usually Barbie is very popular. I worked for the government for a little while, for the U.S. House of Representatives, and in the restaurant industry as a manager, bartender. I'm one of the few gringos who knows how to make a pisco sour. Not as well, it's not in my blood, so not as well as here in Lima, but it's all in the shake. And as I mentioned, I lived in Ecuador and Peru, here at the Universidad de Lima, and I taught at Universidad de Salamanca in Spain for 6 months as well. Been to quite a few other countries. The group that I took to, the MBAs that I took to Latin America many times, I also take students to Asia occasionally. So I've taken MBA students to Vietnam, Thailand, also Cambodia, which was very interesting for me. And I do a bit of consulting, mostly in the food and beverage sector, but also a bit related to executive training with cross-cultural management. So let's go. A couple of images here to start things off. As I mentioned, with the groups that I travel with MBA students, we typically visit businesses and factories, government offices. Here is from a few years back an image from a Chilean wine vineyard called Charla. What is interesting about this company is it's organic wine, no pesticides, nothing at all. It's fully organic, and the price point is middle to premium. So about $25 US for a bottle, which is a bit, fairly expensive in Santiago. But they export maybe 50% of their wines, and they built their brand image by competing in international wine tasting competitions in France, Italy, US, etc. This is here in Lima. You know the Aje group. Well, they have a beer called Franca. Who knows Franca? Yeah, you know Franca. It's a beer. Do they still have that beer? No, no more. Well, when they had the beer Franca, we went to the brewery. I don't know if they still have this brewery, or maybe they're making. I think they have Tres Cruces. Do they still have that beer? Tres Cruces. Maybe they make that beer here. Tres Cruces. That's also from Aje Group. But it was a very interesting trip to this factory because the guy who gave us the tour was from the Netherlands, from Holland, and he's a Dutch beer maker. The company purchased used Dutch equipment from a company called Grolsch, and included with the brewing equipment to make the beer was a Dutch beer maker to come for 1 year to show them how to use the equipment and how to make beer the Dutch way, which I thought was quite interesting. So my first topic, I want to dive in now. When you study cross-cultural management and how to enter into different countries, very often we make generalizations about countries. The people from Peru are more collectivistic than individualistic, for example, is something you would find in Hofstede's research. So there's lots of country-level generalizations. GDP per capita in China is about $12,000 a year. That's, or maybe a bit more, but that's a generalization. What I want to do is get a little deeper into regional differences within countries. So if you're looking at expanding your business to another country, is there a particular subculture, is there a particular region of a country that may be different from the macro level generalizations in that country? Is there a way to better match up your strategic proposal to the potential sub-market niche in a foreign country? And I don't think we do enough of this. There have been some papers written about it. It's easier to make broad generalizations. So I'm going to give you some examples, and some of them you'll find fairly interesting, I hope. So we'll talk about culture, sub-economic differences, some technological differences, regional political differences within countries. Maybe you've heard of this Professor Pankaj Gemwalt. He created something called the cage distance framework. And basically what Gemwalt said was, look, if you're thinking about expanding your business to another country, you might want to look at 4 factors: cultural, administrative, political, economic, and geographic, and assess how different the potential market entry country is to your home country. How big is the cultural difference? How big is that gap? How large is the gap between the governments and how they operate and the institutional environment? So Gemwalt argued, you can take a good look at and measure with these 4 factors, essentially the distance between the home and host country. Now, is that useful? Sure, it's useful at I think, an intellectual level. However, some of the macro level data may lead you to some misconceptions, some misunderstandings. Today, if you look at the data and you have a luxury item, a premium product, let's say expensive wine from Chile. If you look at the data, you might say, well, China might not be a good market. There's probably not enough wealthy people in China. The culture is very different. Well, I would argue differently. I would argue against that. There is a lot of money in China, and there's a lot of premium demand for premium goods in China. And it may only be in certain cities, certain regions. So making them, getting behind the macro level is, I think, very important here. If you look at this, Hofstede, most people are more familiar with Hofstede's initial 4 dimensions. He, with another scholar, came up with some other dimensions later on, such as indulgence. He called it indulgence versus restraint. And you can see I have some countries listed here in Asia. But basically what indulgence is supposed to measure is when people are passionate about buying something and they want immediate recognition and immediate response to their impulse. So indulgence stands for instant gratification, if you will. And the opposite of indulgence is restraint, where people may want something, but they will save for it, not buy it right away. And you can see, China is very low here compared to the U.S. is high. I looked up, Peru is about 46, the score. So in the middle, not too far from the U.S. But my question is, this is interesting, does it vary within countries? Is there more indulgence in Shanghai versus Beijing? I don't know the answer to that, but I think it's a good question to ask. we're looking at just the country level. In the U.S., are the people in Nebraska more restrained, less indulgent than New York? I would say yes. So it's the regional differences, I think, that really matter with matching up your proposal, your product entry to a market. So my idea is to go deeper. I call this MIST, microeconomic, looking at the subcultural or sub-economic variations within countries. Technographic, what are some of the technological variations within countries, subcultural differences, and then regional governments. I know in my country, in the U.S., each state has quite a bit of freedom and autonomy to determine policies for foreign direct investment, for tax breaks for foreign companies to enter. You have many factories in Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi for non-U.S. car companies, automobile companies, Japanese companies, German companies, because they were given a tax incentive, a tax break to enter those states. And that made the cost of entry much less expensive for these companies. So I have a few examples I'll show you that relate to this concept. Here you can see, I know I'm on Zoom, but I want to walk over there. That's okay. So you can see, let's say you were curious about targeting Christians or Catholics. You could look around the world, but maybe your product is designed for a certain type of religious affiliation, Muslim. Well, if you look here in India, you have 37 million Christians in India. 37, well, projected. That's by 2050. Today it's about 30 million. They're projected to have 300 million Muslims in India by 2050. So the sub-religious differences within India are pretty significant for sure. So by 2050, you're going to have 8 times more Christians in India than the entire country of Ireland. More Muslims in India than these 4 countries combined already. If you look at GDP per capita, I find this to be quite interesting. This is from a couple years ago, but you can still look, and this is the nominal figure, but I think this is from 2019. Nevertheless, it would make you conclude, because China's higher now, but it would make you conclude that, look, India, China, look at India, only $2,000 a year, maybe it's $4,000 now, but still very low average. Okay, but are there pockets of wealth within India? Are there pockets of wealth within China, within Vietnam? For sure, there are. And you can look at this. This is one of my favorite new graphics that I found. So this came out recently. The cities in the world with the most billionaires. And these are the 10 cities in the entire world with the most billionaires. 5 are now in China, with number 1, Beijing, passing New York. So there are more billionaires in Beijing than New York today. And if you look, you have Shenzhen, Hong Kong, Shanghai, Hangzhou, and New York, San Francisco, and then Moscow, Mumbai. If you ever have the opportunity to look at the Forbes world's richest people in the world list, it's very interesting. So you have basically a ranking of the top of all the billionaires in the world. But you can look at it, you can sort it by age and by country. To me, what's absolutely fascinating is when you get beyond the first 100, you start to see about 30 out of every 100 of the billionaires are from China. And even today, in the 100 wealthiest people in the world, approximately 40 are from what would be classified as emerging markets, 40 of the top 100. The UK has maybe 2 now in the top 100. That's it. San Francisco always will have billionaires. New York always. But the China, if there are that many billionaires in Shanghai or Beijing, how many millionaires are there? Thousands, tens of thousands in those cities of millionaires. And there is a growing affinity for luxury items in India and in China, for sure, among the wealthy people. Even in the U.S., you could see some regional differences in income per capita. And a lot of this is relative because you have variation in cost of living, of course, within the U.S. So it's very expensive to live in New York, and especially in New York City. But New York, you can see the income per capita, $85,000 per year for the state of New York. That's the state. If you go 1 hour from New York City, the income level drops off fast. So New York City, the income per capita is probably 100,000. Manhattan, which is basically the island in the middle of New York City, is probably 125,000 income per capita, maybe more. So you have these regional differences, not only within the U.S., but even within the states. Massachusetts, where I work, about 80,000 as well, 82,000. The city of Boston is certainly over 100,000 income per capita. So a very high income, but a very expensive place to live. And you can see at the lower end, the black state down here is Mississippi, 37,000. So less than half income per capita of Massachusetts. So my point is, you can't really just throw everybody in the U.S. into one pot and say, okay, the average income is 65,000 or whatever. No, there are significant differences within the country. And you can see some other factors that I think are worth considering when thinking about other markets. Are people happy? If you think about the indulgence versus restraint concept, you have a list here of happiness rankings. Germany, US, 15th in the world, 18th. I think number 1 was Denmark or Sweden. Scandinavia, they tend to have the happiest, the most happy countries. But this relates to certain products and how you would market and target customers. Economic freedom measures essentially the trade barriers that exist when trying to get into a country. And you can see, for example, Singapore is a country with very low trade barriers, very low tariffs, very easy to get a permit, very efficient shipping ports, very little corruption. So Singapore is an easy place to do business. My question again is, if you look at the US, Japan, Thailand, ranked pretty high, but within those countries, are there variations? And I could again look at the US, and I can stand here and tell you that absolutely, if you try to move a container from Lima, from the port of Callao to Los Angeles versus Miami versus Newark, New Jersey, the cost is going to be different, not just the cost to move the container by sea, but upon entry, the warehousing cost, the cost of moving that container into the U.S. through different ports, it will cost a different amount, and it will take more time in some ports versus others. So the barriers vary within countries as well. I actually saw this a few years ago, and I keep looking for more updated lists, but this is a map that has U.S. states plotted or different countries plotted onto U.S. states with similar sized total GDPs. I don't know if Peru is plotted on here, but you can see, for example, Massachusetts and Thailand. So Thailand, the Thai economy is about the same size total as the economy of the state of Massachusetts. The Thai population is 10 times larger than Massachusetts. So you have a lot of variation within the U.S. in income, as I showed you, the income per capita, but the total size of the economy per state. You can see Brazil and Texas, India. I think India has passed California now, but California has 40 million people, and India has about 1.4 billion people. I took a closer look just a couple weeks ago at the 2021 total GDPs, and you can see Massachusetts is about 530 billion GDP compared to Thailand, Belgium, Israel, Ireland, which are all close. But some of these European countries, such as Ireland and Belgium, have small populations and very high GDPs as well. And I mentioned different structures within states, and you could look at other countries and find this as well. Beyond the U.S., I think the U.S. is fairly interesting if you're thinking about working with different states. This is the income taxes. So this is just personal income, but business income tax rates vary by state as well. So if you live in the state of New York and you make $100,000 a year, which, as I mentioned, in New York City, that's average. In somewhere like Wyoming, that's excellent. But you pay 10% state income tax in New York, and then you pay federal to the U.S. government, maybe 30%. If that same person lives in Florida, works for the same company, still pays the 30% to the federal government or whatever the rate is, but zero to the state of Florida. The state of Florida has 0% income tax, no income tax. Same with Texas, no income tax. Now, you probably wonder, how does the government survive in Florida? Where do they get their money? Well, sales tax, hotel tax, all the people who go to Disney, they pay lots of taxes, restaurant taxes, real estate tax. So there's other taxes to make up for it. But this is very interesting. Actually, New Hampshire recently introduced a tax, which is a little state up here. Above Massachusetts. And the reason why is because Massachusetts is about, here is it? Here, 5%. But a lot of people were living in New Hampshire and working in Boston. So make the big money in Boston and then drive an hour home, and you pay tax based on where you live, not where you work. So people would drive home to New Hampshire 1 hour and pay no tax, and then go back to work and make nice money. So New Hampshire implemented a tax and ruined it for all the people in who are from New Hampshire. But so culturally, you can look at language as a proxy for subcultural differences, and I like to show slides and talk to my students about different official and unofficial languages within countries. India has, I think, 16 official languages. That's official in India, and I don't think they do it anymore, but the Indian money, the rupee, used to list the amount of the money in each of the 16 languages. So it would be in Hindu, Sanskrit, English, Arabic, and so on. 100 rupee, however you say that or write it in those different languages, was listed on the rupee. I think they changed the money though. But my point is, if you're if your language makes it onto the money, it's probably a significantly large subculture. You can see here in some of the languages that are primary languages spoken throughout South America. Obviously, Quechua, Aymara, and the mountains of Peru, very, very strong, but very representative of subcultures. If you go to India or China, you will certainly find similar patterns where you have different language differences within China of indigenous people or just regional languages that exist and are symbolic of different cultures. Here's another map of the US, and a professor from Tufts University essentially looked back in time at immigrants going back 250 years, where they came from and where they went after arriving in the US. And he redrew the map based on what he thought were the cultural, subcultural differences in the US today. So for example, I'll point out a few interesting patterns. He considers the Northeast here Yankeedom, and the left coast here, the dark blue, it comes all the way up here. Basically, he argues that those cultures are quite similar to each other. And if you go to California, you will notice this. If Los Angeles, San Francisco, along the coast, San Francisco is quite similar to Boston. Not just the way it looks, but the way people think, the way business operates, and so on. But if you go here to Sacramento, to the farmlands of California, it's closer to Arizona or even Texas. The mindset, the values, the way people think, the way they operate. So to lump everybody together in California is I think, a mistake. Interestingly, and I totally agree with this, he calls New York, metropolitan New York, considers it its own subculture, New Netherland. And if who's been to New York here? Quite a few people. There really is, it's hard to compare that city to anything else. You have every culture in the world. You have this passion for capitalism, but you also have it balanced out with a passion for doing social good. It's a very unique place. And I think culturally, it's almost impossible to make any kind of generalization about New York City, except it's different from everything else. I think that's the only thing you could say about it. I was just there a couple of weeks ago, and it was a nice day. My flight was delayed 5 hours, so I decided to take the train, which is about a 1 hour walk across the whole city from where I was. And I said, I'm just going to walk. And it is such an incredible place to walk and look around and watch people. It's absolutely fascinating. Here is a map. This is from the US Census 20 years ago, but I think it's quite revealing of the second language. So the language other than English, this is by county in the US, spoken at home in the US. Again, symbolic of cultural differences. So Spanish, number one, is the second language other than English in almost all of the US. Now, we don't know by this slide, we don't know how far that number 1 and 2, or how far apart, or how many people. Some of these counties up here may only have 1,000 people. That's small. But then you have German, the dark blue. German is the second language in these countries. Red is Native American or indigenous languages. This is French. Here, coming down from Quebec and Canada, and here as a legacy of the time where the French actually had what was called the Louisiana Territory. And there's still a lot of French speakers here in New Orleans. And if you look at patterns of migration to the U.S. over time, the English arrived first, and then there was different waves of people entering the U.S. So this is going back 160 years, but it's still, I think, symbolic of who are the people living in these places today in the U.S. Here you have, in 1860, many Irish settled on the east coast of the U.S. in the 1860s. It was a very challenging time in Ireland. Many people left and came here. China, number one, this is the country of birth of immigrants in 1860. So this is where people were born, in the number one country of birth. So China was number one way back in 1860 there. Germany, all the way through here. So we fast forward to 1920, just 100 years ago. Now you have already many English and Irish settling on the East Coast. Still, many Germans here. And remember the map I showed you with still today, a lot of German speakers, second language in this part of the country. But also many Scandinavians came from Sweden, Norway, Finland, Denmark. If you go today to Minnesota, or Michigan, northern Michigan, you will find a lot of names that are Scandinavian names, Norwegian names, partly because of this migration 100 years ago. But then you started to get more of a diverse mix of Europeans coming to the East Coast. Italy, Poland, Germany, Russia. You can see Mexico starts coming here. Italy to California. And then today, the number one country of birth of foreign of immigrants to the U.S. is Mexico. But except for Mexico, we have some significant variation within the U.S. So this, I think, is quite interesting. If you look, for example, Massachusetts, where I teach, China is number two after Mexico. So Massachusetts, we do indeed have many Chinese immigrants in Massachusetts. If you look down here at Cuba in Florida, if you go to Miami, metropolitan Miami, it's not going to surprise you at all. But there are some surprises. Look at this. That's the state of Oklahoma, Vietnam. So you have many Vietnamese. I didn't know that in Oklahoma. Or how about over here, the Philippines, in Wyoming, in Nevada, California, second to Mexico for the country of birth of foreign-born residents. Honduras in Louisiana, Dominican Republic, mostly in New York City here. India, look at all of the India. Many Indians have arrived the U.S. and they don't all go, I guess the point is, they don't all go to the same place. So people spread out to different states, and there's a diaspora of people who arrive and become essentially anchors for people to follow them. Zooming in, again, staying with the topic of regional differences within the U.S. and even within states, here's the little state of Massachusetts where I work. We have a population of maybe 7 million people in Massachusetts, but you have some very interesting subcultures within this little state. 71% of the city of Lawrence is Latino Hispanic, so about 50,000 people. You have Situate, Massachusetts, about 50% Irish. Quincy, Massachusetts, about 15% Chinese. I was actually very interested. There's a city up here called Lowell, Massachusetts, and it's the second it has the second largest number of Cambodians in the United States. First is, I think, San Jose, California. Second, Lowell, Massachusetts. And I found that out because I was getting a car repaired there in Lowell, and I saw a Buddhist monastery that looked exactly like one I saw in Cambodia. And why is that? And I realized there were lots of Cambodians living here. And you can see Germans, Polish, Portuguese, this whole region of Massachusetts has become a destination for migrants from Portugal, the Azores Islands, and Brazil as well. Okay, shifting gears. So that was an overview of basically what I think are subcultural differences to consider when analyzing different markets. Now I'm going to walk through 3 research projects that I've been working on with colleagues. They're each a bit different. I'm not going to dive too deep into the data or statistics, just an overview of what we're doing. The first one is revisiting the stuck in the middle. And we studied steakhouses in the U.S. I'll talk about that one first. Second will be cultural distance and moral intensity, and I've been talking a little bit about cultural distance. And third, essentially Chinese investment in Latin America. So going back in time, Michael Porter, a professor from Harvard, came up with a very famous strategy and a matrix where he compared low cost versus differentiation to the scope, narrow or broad target. And what Porter argued basically was, look, you want to focus on one of these corners, and then your strategy will be more effective. And Porter even says this, don't be stuck in the middle. Basically, if you're stuck in the middle, you don't have a strategy. You're not leaning in one direction. You don't have any true intention. And there have been some debates about this over the years. And if you look at, for example, at the U.S. airline sector, there are some companies, such as Southwest Airlines, that you could argue are in the middle. Their price point's in the middle, their level of service is in the middle, but they're doing quite well. Why is that? So we decided with one of my MBA students, we decided to take a look at just one industry, one segment of one industry. And we looked here, so this is stuck in the middle, what I just said. It's basically, you want to avoid being without a strategy. So we took a look at about 30 restaurants in the US, and this was kind of fun for me. And I actually did go to maybe 6 or 7 of these restaurants and make sure that the quality of the food was good. I mean, I had to go do that. But here's what we found. And what did we do? We literally went online and looked at the menu of 30 different restaurants and in different locations. So Outback in New York City charges a different price than Outback in Oklahoma City. But we looked at the menu of similar items in different cities. So 8-ounce filet mignon, for example, chicken, and then we looked at some other factors, number of locations that the chain has, and so on, and international presence. And based on the information we gathered, we plotted these restaurants, steak restaurants, into where we thought they would fit in a strategic group map based on their strategy. And you could see some did lean very heavily into certain corners, but we found really 3 groups, here, and here. These 3 were starting to move toward the middle. They definitely were not extreme differentiators or low-cost players. And to Michael Porter's defense, the most successful, the most profitable companies were these 2 and this one. But we found that number 4, this mid-range differentiator, was actually doing quite well and was not too far behind number 2 and 3. So here's a group of companies, a sub-market within the steakhouse sector that was actually doing quite well with what I would say is a stuck-in-the-middle strategy. I'm not going to go over this, but you can just take a look at some of the restaurants we covered, such as, and if you've been to the U.S., you may know some of these, Longhorn Steakhouse, Ruth's Chris, Del Frisco's, which is a premium. So the prices varied, and these were for similar size steak. So I think we did a 12-ounce sirloin here, $55 average price. For the same steak at Longhorn Steakhouse, you pay about $20. So obviously this is symbolic of the strategy, the price point for this same item. And then you can see how we then went deeper and classified these into different categories. So we're writing a conceptual paper, more of a practitioner paper based on this. Next paper. So I'm going to go about 5 minutes on this paper and then 5 more on the other paper, and then that'll be it. I'll take any questions. So the idea of cultural distance is something that's been around for a long time. And it's hard to measure, although some people have tried to measure it. It's even more difficult to measure if you think about subcultural differences. But if you look here, for example, the blue is Hofstede's individualism. The orange is Hofstede's indulgence. So that's China, Colombia. So you could, if you look at this, you would say, well, both China and Colombia are leaning toward collectivistic, so small cultural distance. Okay, is it the same type of collectivism? I don't think so. And what part of China are we talking about? And what part of Colombia are we talking about? I've been to Colombia, many of you have as well. I mean, there are regional differences in Colombia, for sure. The difference between Barranquilla and Bogota, culturally different. The difference between Shanghai and Sichuan province, very different. So I think looking at what the differences are, and you can see indulgence very different here. You could measure this, but the question we're asking in this paper is, how does this relate to ethics and ethical decision making? Even if you accept the gaps in cultural differences, can that be plotted against and can you measure differences in ethical decision making as well? So this is an old model that was proposed in the 90s, and we basically are collecting data on some of these factors. And what we found is 2 factors related quite well to collectivism and indulgence. Social consensus, for example, basically what this Professor Jones argued was that social consensus and proximity are the 2 we're using, that these factors influence ethical decision making. For example, proximity is how close the issue is to you. So if people are more opposed to bribery, if it's going to affect them personally or affect their business or affect their life. But if there's a bribe happening in Brazil today, there probably is. There's probably bribes happening all over the world today. But it doesn't affect you as much, you don't care as much. But if it's happening here in Lima, and it's affecting the business that your brother works for, you're a little more curious, maybe a little more concerned about what are the implications. So we're looking in this paper at individualism, collectivism, indulgence, restraint, and we're trying to match those concepts up against what we think are moral themes that align well with these cultural themes. And we're collecting data, and we're going to try to measure some of the gaps here and see if there are any correlations. And then the last paper that is of huge curiosity of mine, and I really have no idea. I tell you, sometimes you start research projects and you don't know why, but you're just curious about something. And I'm at the point in my career where I just want to do things that are interesting to me. And I'm very interested in Chinese investment in Latin America. So I started off this September with one of my graduate assistants, and we sat down and we started looking through all sorts of newspapers in Spanish, English, and in Portuguese. He's from Brazil, and started to look back to 2005 at all of the major Chinese investments in Latin America. Now, some are coming from Chinese banks, and some are companies, foreign direct investments companies. And what we're doing is coming up with a list of every single large project. I know you had one of the big ports here, Chancay. It was a big major Chinese investor. China was a major investor there. There are many projects throughout Latin America. We have about 100 that we've gathered so far. And I'll show you some of the numbers. I think what we're going to do next is really try to get behind the why. Why are the Chinese investing in certain projects and why certain countries? Venezuela has been one of the top recipients of Chinese investment. And there's some pretty good reasons for that. But strategically, are there other reasons? Beyond diplomatic reasons, are there other reasons, such as to help build infrastructure so China can have better access to raw materials and natural resources that they're buying, such as copper? Yes. So we're going to try to get to the bottom of this to some extent, if it's possible. And this is what we have so far. And this is still a work in progress, but this is from 2005 to 2022. The total, based on just the projects that we've collected thus far, you can see Venezuela and Brazil by far are leading the way in investments. And also by year, we have a plotted by year. Things started to slow down before COVID, and I'm not sure why that was. Part of it had to do with China's Belt and Road Initiative, where a lot of money is being invested in countries closer to China, but there has been a bit of a resurgence lately, and COVID, of course, slowed down lots of investment from everybody around the world. So we're gonna go get deeper into we have the projects that align with these numbers. We have it by industry. And we're going to look at correlations between what China has done, where they've gone, where they've invested money, and any diplomatic or strategic implications. So that's another project that's very ongoing. And here you can see diplomatically the recognition of China versus Taiwan. Only a few countries remain in Latin America with formal recognition of Taiwan as a separate country. A few more in the Caribbean as well. Okay, that's my presentation. About 1 hour, perfect. All right. Thank you.